to the states. Focus on creating jobs, getting 20-some million people back to work so that they can contribute to our tax base, so that they can contribute to Medicare and to Social Security. Do a jobs program, and that will strengthen some of these programs that we care so deeply about.
Well, and Congresswoman Edwards, I would say, too, that, and Congresswoman Jackson Lee, Medicare, yes, speaks to the health care needs of senior households, but there's also a stability there. There's a security so that some of the available expenditures that are out there today from seniors investing in their community, spending in their community, would be lost. And so the economic recovery then again gets threatened. And when I look at this, all through that blob of color that of which you speak, all during that time was like a loss of 8.2 million jobs. So where was the quantifiable benefit of all of this relief to those perched way high on the income ladder? There wasn't a corresponding benefit. So we need to recognize what works and works well. And when Medicare has worked for all these years, why would we threaten it? And what I think bothers me the most, I'm on the Budget Committee, and today we had a hearing with Secretary Sebelius. And when you talk about bending that health care cost curve, the Republican plan, after they end Medicare and they toss it to the market for the shopping to be done by our senior community, there's no bending of the cost curve. They're saying sharpen the pencil, bottom line benefit through competition to help our seniors. We have watched, Representative Jackson Lee, since the start of Medicare, the private sector insurance costs have risen by over 5,000%. That's 5,000%. The track record on Medicare, no administrative burden to speak of, no heavy one, no marketing budget, no wasteful expenditures, no high profit columns. We've seen back-to-back profit columns go off, out of sight for these industries. And when we look at this, when we say we need to go to the bank to borrow, that's helping the friends in the big bank industry. When we need to put it into private sector and end Medicare, that's helping the deep pockets of the insurance industry. This is like helping those who are looking for more business at the expense of containing costs, bending a health care curve, providing for dignity for the senior community, and shedding a program that has worked for nearly half a century, and that people have now advocated should be there for their children and their grandchildren and generations yet unborn. That is uniquely American. That's uniquely American. It shows and expresses a degree of sensitivity, of compassion, of ability to make things happen. And you know what? A budget, a plan that we put together here is merely a listing of our priorities. What do we deem most essential? And when you can reach 46, 47 million people in their golden years and provide guaranteed health care, that ought to be a high priority, not taking the savings of ending Medicare to pay for millionaire tax cuts, billionaire tax cuts, oil industry handouts. I mean, let's get real. Let's get real here. Let's get compassionate. Let's be understanding of what we're ending as a tremendously sound bit of history.
If the gentleman would yield.
Absolutely, Representative Jackson Lee.
I thank you for your passion, and what you're saying makes me think of what we're doing even to the younger generation, because you just made a point that it's lasted for over half a century, if I can use that term, over 50 years. And it is a framework that can be in place for those who are young. And if we take it apart, we will not have this structure that has been helpful. There's no reason to ignore modernizing. We're not against that. Looking at ways to improve Medicare, but that's not what our Republican friends are saying. They're talking about ending it as we know it, vouchering it. And there was a story about the running of the bulls. And frankly, I have this image on a voucher plan, or the plan that would come about through cuts in guaranteed benefits, of the running of the bulls, the running of seniors, running toward trying to get that last voucher that's being handed out, trampling each other because they are seeking that one lifeline that they need. In addition, we need to be very real about Medicare. Medicare is the infrastructure of our hospital system. You cut into Medicare, you're talking about closing hospitals, you're talking about eliminating physicians, and you're talking about ending care as we know it. Is there any understanding to the fact that we need to be adults and sit down. When I left my city of Houston, I spoke to my constituents on Sunday, held a press conference to indicate my commitment to helping to preserve Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. The idea was that this will impact our city. It'll see jobs lost. We have the Texas Medical Center. It'll see businesses closed and people having the inability to care for themselves or their senior family members. So this simple issue of a debt ceiling speaks, I think, very eloquently to the need for common sense. And you have laid out very clearly, we've had it for this period of time. We've been able to keep a structure that has helped to save lives. It has this amount of life. It can have a longer life as we continue to improve it and to ensure that there's no waste, fraud, and abuse. And for me, I cannot imagine a picture of seniors trampling each other to get that last voucher, or being able to be told, or having to be told by their government, the country that they've served and worked for and raised their children, there is no room at the end for you. There is no opportunity for your health care. There's no more Medicare. By the way, we had to pay tax cuts, or we had to give the billionaires and rich folk the long period of time of tax holidays, and we just didn't have any opportunity for you. That is unacceptable, and you know what? It's un-American, and I think we can do better, and we need to fight to protect Medicare, as we are doing as Democrats. And I would encourage and welcome my friends, my Republican friends, to join us in doing the right thing.
Well, you know, Representative Jackson Lee, you talked about strengthening it and improving Medicare, not ending it. Some have suggested as much as $156 billion could be saved by bulk purchasing for our pharmaceutical needs for the program, for Medicare. That also is a savings of probably, I think I've heard, $27 billion as the number for seniors themselves, because there is a fraction that they assume in those costs. So if we do that, we send over not only the savings for government, but we send it over to the senior community also. And so there's ways to address fraud and inefficiency. The New York Times reported just a short while ago that there were double chest CT scans being done, CT chest scans being done, and that the federal government was overbilled by some $25 million. Now, that's one small example of accountability or lack thereof, and the need to continually stay vigilant in our efforts to search out fraud and inefficiency. But take it, make it work, strengthen it, and provide for that continuation. Just the stability that we can provide enables seniors to breathe more easily, to know that a basic core need for them that's correlated as they grow older. Any of us grows older, it's correlated that you're going to require that health care attachment. And how dare we, I say we, how dare they, how dare a Republican majority in this House suggest it's worked well, it's been there for seniors for 46 years, but we're ending it because we're going to box the situation. You want your debt ceiling limit to be raised so America can pay her bills? You're going to do it with spending cuts, and we're starting with Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid. Well, isn't that nice? That's a take it and weep scenario. And that is terrible, because the people that would weep deserve our voice to be heard resoundingly on the floor, to say we step in and we defend the program, and more importantly, we defend the recipients of the program. Representative Edwards, Maryland's 4th District Rep.
Well, I thank the gentleman from New York and the gentleman from Texas for pointing out the fallacy of this argument that somehow in this discussion of lifting the debt ceiling, which I believe each of us voted to lift that debt ceiling in a clean vote. Yeah. We understand that that is our moral responsibility. It's our obligation to meet the full faith and credit obligations of the United States. But that's not what this discussion is, and it is precisely the reason that I caution us against putting into the debt ceiling discussion any changes to Medicare benefits and Social Security benefits and Medicaid. And the reason is because, as I've demonstrated by showing this chart, and I would love to say that this is my chart, but it's not. It was produced by the Independent Congressional Budget Office, and it shows the contributing factors, the significant contributing factors in these colors here of the long-term debt. And that's what we're talking about, raising the debt ceiling to meet those obligations that have already been laid out. And some people have described that those of us who are speaking in favor of Medicare and Social Security and making sure that we protect Medicare and Social Security beneficiaries from cuts, that we're passionate. But that passion is deeply connected to fact. It is connected to the fact that we are passionate about the guaranteed benefit of Medicare. It's connected to the fact that we are committed to lowering prescription drug costs by closing the donut hole, whereas the Ryan budget, the Republican budget, would open that donut hole all over again for our seniors, causing them to dip into their already fragile pockets to meet their prescription drug needs. The gentleman from New York has already pointed to ways in which we could actually negotiate prescription drugs in bulk so that we could significantly lower our costs for our seniors. But that's not what's on the table. Those of us who are passionate have been described as passionate because we want to ensure that our seniors are receiving primary care and getting preventive care so that it does bend that cost curve. That's the source of our passion, but it's rooted in fact. And what is really true is the fact that our seniors did not cause the significant factors that are related to our long-term debt. I want to repeat that to the gentleman. I know that you know this, but it's really important for the American people to understand that the contributors to our long-term debt are tax cuts that are not paid for millionaires and billionaires. We should get rid of them. We should not be protecting those tax cuts off the backs of our seniors. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the President has already begun a drawdown. It could be more significant so that we could save in the long run. Making certain that we get people back to work so that they're contributing to our tax base in the way that we need. And of course, we know that we have to raise revenue. We must raise revenue. Our seniors understand that, but what we cannot do is shift the burden for these things that were not caused by seniors onto the backs of our seniors by pushing them into really unfair cuts to their Medicare and Social Security benefits.
Very well said. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm just going to do a bit of close and then ask for each of our representatives that remain here on the floor. We were joined earlier by Representative Chu from California to offer your sentiments, and then we'll bring the hour to a close. But you know, what I think is very important to note is that if we can find ways to save on Medicare, we should invest that in Medicare to strengthen Medicare. If we can find ways to save in Social Security, reinvest in Social Security. They deserve to be standalones because they are prime opportunities, programs for strengthening the fabric of America's families. So that should be a separate turf and not be using these dollars, these savings, as the Republicans would end Medicare, to somehow bring that over in a fungible faction to pay for these tax cuts. You know, today I talked to my medical colleges, and they are going to get impacted by the cuts to NIH. They have, in the New York State, we probably have over $1 billion in revenue streams that go to hospitals for research. So you cut the NIH program, you put more people out of work, and you cut a revenue stream for hospitals that need to train the human infrastructure that will make all of our health care programs work. Similarly, when you look at our need to compete effectively in a global economy on clean energy and innovation, the winner of that race will be the go-to nation that will create stability for generations of their workers. Why shouldn't America be #1 in that investment? So if we can find savings somewhere, or if we do create revenues, They need to go into investments to grow jobs. That's what America told us at the polls last November. We want jobs to be the #1 priority. We haven't done a jobs bill in this House, but we've come up and found ways to end Medicare, which is vulnerable, which right now is so vulnerable to this discussion on the debt ceiling limit. We have to end that crazy plan, and we need to go forward with a sensible plan that enables us to invest in jobs, invest in our senior community, invest in their well-being, and to, again, see these two programs worthy of saving and strengthening. And if we have the economic means, let's do it. Representative Jackson Lee, we'll go to you and then to Representative Edwards, and we'll be done with our hour.
Thank you very much for leading us in this discussion. The message should be, albeit we have some concerns, we are not broke. We need to fix jobs and investment, and we need to save Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. They have not contributed to our debt, and we cannot allow seniors to run like bulls to seek medical care in this great and wonderful country. I, for one, will not stand for it. Thank you, and I yield back to you.
Representative Edwards, and we'll be through.
Well, I thank the gentleman for bringing us together. I hope that what the American people understand is that the Democrats in this House are prepared to protect Medicare benefits and Social Security benefits for our seniors and for future generations, that our young people should know that as they enter the workforce, because we are going to make sure that they have jobs for the future, that they will be contributing to Medicare and Social Security for future generations. This is really a values test. This is where we have to have the perfect alignment of policy, of politics, and our values, and that rests in protecting Medicare and Social Security from benefits cuts. And with that, I yield.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With that, we yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and to bring to the attention of this body some subject matter that doesn't often get a debate here on the floor, but it does get some discussion in special order time and sometimes in the 1 minute and 5 minutes that members present to you here in this great deliberative place that we have the privilege to serve in. And one of the things that I've wanted to bring before your attention here this evening is the immigration issue here in the United States. And it's something that I don't know that has been discussed here for some time. But I bring this forward because it's an important issue. It's very essential that we sustain and maintain and enhance the rule of law here in the United States. So I bring this forward, and a number of things are on my mind. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is a subject that was reported on Fox News July 11th. And I picked up this article, and I want to express this to you on what's going on. I introduced early in January one of the first days of business here in this new 112th Congress, the Birthright Citizenship Act of 2011. And, Mr. Speaker, I brought this act forward working with people who have been leaders on this issue for some time. And one of them would be our friend Nathan Deal, now Governor Deal of Georgia, who was the lead on this issue when he served here in the United States Congress. And also some of the successor people that were involved in that would be Congressman Phil Gingrey of Georgia and the incoming freshman from Georgia, Rob Woodall, and from California, Congressman Gary Miller, one who has been a strong proponent of the rule of law and standing up for the rights of American citizens. These people and others have been strong supporters of the Birthright Citizenship Act, and because of my role on the Immigration Committee, where I have been for now going into the 9th year, it seemed to be a better fit for me to carry this piece of legislation. And so I stepped forward with it because we needed to take a position. What's going on, Mr. Speaker, is that in the United States of America, there are people that erroneously read the 14th Amendment of the Constitution in the component that addresses what we call birthright citizenship. And it says in the 14th Amendment that all persons born and or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are American citizens. All persons born or naturalized and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are American citizens. Now, the circumstances there are that it's created a misinterpretation of this section of the 14th Amendment has created birthright tourism. And so we have you might see a $30,000 turnkey operation going on where a pregnant woman in China, and she's probably going to have a benefactor that would sponsor this, could receive a turnkey operation for a little tourism trip into the United States. Get her on an airplane, smuggle her into the United States one way or another, where she'd have a baby. She would be 8.5 months pregnant or so, theoretically, have the baby here in the United States. The baby would get a nice new American birth certificate with its little footprint stamped on it. And then that baby might go back to China with the baby's mother, or the mother might stay here in the United States with family and friends, relation, whomever might want to harbor that mother and or child. And when the child's old enough, the child can sponsor the extended family to come into the United States by virtue of that automatic citizenship that's conferred upon a child that's born here to an illegal mother and a who-knows father. That's going on not just in rare circumstances, and not, of course, certainly not just with Chinese. In fact, that's not one of the larger numbers. It's happening in this country someplace between 340,000 times a year and 750,000 times a year, Mr. Speaker. We have people that sneak into the United States for the purposes of having a baby so that baby can become an American citizen. And I believe, as the chairman of the Full Judiciary Committee, Lamar Smith, believes, is that citizenship should be precious. It should be precious. It shouldn't be dealt out. It shouldn't be something that you can buy a turnkey ticket to game the system to have a baby that then is automatically an American citizen, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Mr. Speaker, I'll argue that that Chinese woman that flies into the United States with a $30,000 turnkey tourism for birthright is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, not in the way that was envisioned by the people that wrote the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution was put in place to guarantee that the babies born to formerly slaves and now then at that time of ratification freed slaves would be American citizens. They wouldn't, that the babies born to the freed slaves would not be denied all of the rights of citizenship as were guaranteed to them in the 13th and 14th Amendment. And it took into account that babies born on Indian reservations, some of them, would have lost their rights, their tribal rights on those reservations if they had become automatic American citizens. So some of the Native Americans said no, they didn't want that conferred upon them. And our founding fathers, excuse me, it wasn't founding fathers, but the drafters of the 14th Amendment then wrote language in it to preclude automatic citizenship to any Homo sapien that was born within the territory of the United States. They had to also be subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And this Congress went through a great deal of debate in the House and in the Senate on what that actually meant in the clause subject to the jurisdiction thereof. It was not contemplated that the children of diplomats would become automatic American citizens. It was not contemplated that certain Native Americans born in certain reservations would be subject to the jurisdiction thereof and become American citizens, but it was contemplated that the children born to freed slaves would be American citizens. It's a guarantee. That's the guarantee, and it was written with a significant amount of wisdom. They could not have anticipated that America would get so lazy and so lax that this constitutional amendment would drift its way into a practice, an erroneous practice of conferring automatic citizenship on mostly any baby that would be born in America. Now, here's how it is. If there's a plane flying through the United States, And let's just say that this plane is bound from China to Toronto, which does happen, Mr. Speaker, and it was going to be a flight that was going to be a direct flight and drop into Toronto. But because of weather conditions or maybe mechanical problems, it had to land in Chicago. Now let's just say that if there's a woman pregnant on that plane who is flying into Toronto and the plane lands in Chicago and it's stuck there for mechanical repairs or a weather-related delay, and the woman is inside the security and has the baby's not an American citizen. But if she walks through the security, goes outside of security during the layover and has the baby out there, this baby is an American citizen. That's what's been going on in the practice of this automatic citizenship that I think is an erroneous misinterpretation, and I think a willful misinterpretation, or probably more often a lazy misinterpretation of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And so I've introduced the Birthright Citizenship Act of 2011, along with the friends and colleagues that I mentioned and many others, and a good number of co-sponsors who take the position with me that if a child that's born in America has to be born to at least one legal parent in order to be a citizen of the United States. It's pretty simple. It clarifies the 14th Amendment. It clarifies the clause in the 14th Amendment subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Congress has the authority to do that, and I got concerned about this when there were a couple of senators that were talking about the need to amend the Constitution to fix this problem. But, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't require a constitutional amendment to fix the automatic citizenship practice that is so flawed that it confers an automatic citizenship on as many as 750,000 babies born to illegal parents here into the United States. And to give you an example, it is, as I said, it's not just a Chinese woman that comes over here pregnant to have the baby here, and that happens on a very regular basis. But it's often someone that comes in from neighboring countries. We know that of the criminal aliens that are in our prisons, 2/3 of them come from Mexico. One might presume that a similar number of these automatic citizenship babies also, their mother is a citizen of Mexico in the United States illegally, having the baby here and picking up that automatic citizenship, that birth certificate. They may or may not go back to their home country, but you can bet that when the time comes that child will already be programmed to petition for the family reunification plan, which has our immigration plan in America out of control. Out of control. And so what do we do about this? Well, Birthright Citizenship Act of 2011, and it should be a simple decision for this United States Congress to address this situation, but some will argue, well, subject to the jurisdiction thereof means nothing. That clause in the 14th Amendment doesn't have meaning, therefore it requires that they all be citizens. I think that is a very thin and a very marginal argument at best. The clause must mean something. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are American citizens. There's a reason that it says, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. If everyone born in the territory of the United States is automatically a citizen, you would strike that language from the 14th Amendment, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and it would just simply read, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are American citizens. If that was the intent, if that was the understanding of the 14th Amendment, that's what it would have said, Mr. Speaker. But it says, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And the definition of that phrase is subject to the interpretation of the understanding of what it meant at the time of the ratification of the 14th Amendment. And it meant, subject to the jurisdiction thereof didn't mean that there were going to be automatic citizenship on illegals. Granted, we didn't have much for immigration laws at the time. There wasn't enough human migration to be very concerned about it. But they clearly didn't intend to confer automatic citizenship on Native Americans born on reservations that were not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. They clearly didn't intend to confer automatic citizenship on the children born to the diplomats or their staff, or for tourists for that matter. And I mentioned the tourism part when I explained what happens if a plane lands in Chicago on its way to Toronto and a baby's born Which side of the security? Here's automatic citizenship on the U.S. side of the security. That's nuts, Mr. Speaker. Excuse me. And so, but we've gotten lazy and lax with the practice of conferring automatic citizenship. And so people don't challenge it. And I'm really worried about an administration. Actually, I've been worried about a couple of those administrations since I arrived in this town that don't seem to have much vigor for enforcing immigration law. It's pretty frustrating to be here in the United States Congress pounding away to have to pass legislation to fix something that's just a matter of intellectual laziness. But the people that are enforcing this, the people that are handing out birth certificates as almost like candy, aren't challenging it. They don't have a very good constitutional understanding, or there'd be some pushback out there across from the countryside. But in the OB ward of the hospitals around the country, they've got to have stacks of these birth certificates. And when a baby is born, it's almost an automatic process. Here's the footprint, here's the data, here's the birth certificate, send that child off, they're an American citizen. What do we suppose happens if a diplomat or the wife of a diplomat or even the staff of the diplomat comes into the hospital to have a baby? Do they meet them at the door and say, do you happen to be a diplomat? Are you here on some kind of foreign immunity? And you're planning on having a baby here, and do you think that baby's going to be an American citizen? No, we're not going to allow it. The citizenship is not going to be cheapened like that. It doesn't happen, Mr. Speaker. What really happens is the children of diplomats are often conferred with automatic citizenship because the whole system of America is so automatic that any baby born inside U.S. territory is just given the paperwork and the documents. Here's an article that comes out on, it was Fox News, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, reported on July 11th. And the substance of it is this, that the Center for Immigration Studies, good, thorough people, I might add, this is Elizabeth Romenshaw Brown who's written this article. The Center for Immigration Studies says foreign diplomats are obtaining U.S. birth certificates and Social Security numbers for their newborn children, effectively becoming U.S. citizens. On top of their new status in the world, these children carry an additional perk that most Americans do not have, diplomatic immunity. So it creates what what CIS describes as a super citizen. Just like their parents, most are immune to criminal jurisdiction of the United States, creating super citizens. These super citizens are, of course, children of diplomats, and all they need to have is a U.S. birth certificate and a Social Security number, and they're effectively an American citizen. Who's going to challenge it? And there's no question mark or no question on the birth certificate that asks the question, are you a diplomat? Or one of your parents legal? American citizen, perhaps? Those questions don't get asked, so they just routinely stamp those birth certificates and send that child off with automatic citizenship 340 to 750,000 times a year. Some of it are those who are clearly not subject to the jurisdiction thereof. In fact, in the concluding statement in the article, you've got a statement here from one of the proponents of the policy that I advocate. It says all persons, well, let's see, despite Congress's clear intent to not create a completely universal and automatic birthright citizenship policy, the current application of the citizenship clause is so lax, and it is so lax that the United States has a de facto universal birthright citizenship policy that denies U.S. citizenship by birth to no one, including children born to foreign diplomats. Mr. Speaker, that has to change. We intend to change that with the Birthright Citizenship Act of 2011. That's H.R. 140. And I intend to be engaged in that and helping to move that legislation forward. When it gets to the point where the children of diplomats with diplomatic immunity are getting automatic American citizenship just because they're born inside the territory of the United States, perhaps not even born in U.S. soil, but they might even potentially be born in that sovereign territory of the embassy itself, still American citizens. And then they get, and then, Mr. Speaker, we have also an out-of-control legal immigration system. Aside from the illegal immigration, which I talk about quite a lot, the legal immigration system. And if we look back over the last decade, we'll see that we brought in roughly 1.25 million legal immigrants a year. And over that last decade, if you would look at the new jobs created by the United States economy, those new jobs created are going to average about 1.25 million jobs a year. This is before the recession began. These numbers held up then, and they're even stronger now. But the new jobs created by the American economy have been almost exactly the same number of jobs that would be taken by the legal immigrants that come into the United States. If we had shut down and slowed down the legal immigration in the United States over the last 10 years, there would have been, just say, roughly 10 million fewer legal immigrants in America, and we'd have 10 million fewer unemployed Americans. I mean, that's just a simple way of looking at this. And I don't propose that we eliminate all legal immigration, not by any means, Mr. Speaker. But what I do propose is that we do an economic analysis of this. And when we look at real numbers of testimony that's come before the committee under oath, data, here's what we have. I mean, a country should establish an immigration policy that's designed to enhance the economic, the social, and the cultural well-being of the United States of America. That should be our task. And yet, with our legal immigration, that legal immigration that's based upon merit, when we would take a look at what that individual has to offer the United States, when we take a look at what they have for capital to invest, or their ability to assimilate, or their educational background, or their relative youth, so they've got some years to contribute before they start to draw from the system, these are all logical things that we should ask for. But it's only between 7 and 11% of the legal immigration in America that is based upon anything that has to do with what's good for America. And the balance of it would be 89 to 93% of the legal immigration in America is out of the control of the value judgment of the American people, in the hands of the legal immigrants, or sometimes the illegal immigrants themselves. It's out of our control. Birthright citizenship is a piece of that I'm not even sure is part of this equation that I've just described to you. There's a family reunification plan that takes up a big chunk of this. That once someone comes in, they can start bringing in their family and their extended family, and it goes out like a tree to no end. We need to limit that family reunification plan. And we need to roll this thing back around and base the legal immigration in America on merit again. What do they have to offer the United States? And, Mr. Speaker, I'll say also, we had testimony before the committee, and there are a number of strong, faithful representatives that testified there. And some of them are national leaders in the faith community who argued that we need to find a way to accommodate the 11 to 20 million illegals that are here in America and give them a path to citizenship. And every one of them said that they thought they should go to the back of the line. They should go to the back of the line. The 11 to 20 million illegals in America should go to the back of the line, but we should give them a means by which they can earn American citizenship. Well, think about it, Mr. Speaker. Go into the back of the line. Which line? I asked them, which line? And they're, well, back of the line. Now, that's a talking point that apparently wasn't thought about any deeper than that, because if they can't answer the question, which line, they surely don't know where that line is. Is it in the United States, or is it in lines in the foreign countries, people waiting to come into the United States? I would submit that if those who are in the United States illegally are to go to the back of the line, it's not a line in the United States. The people in line to come into the United States legally are by definition not in the United States. They're outside the United States. They're in their home country. They're following the laws of America. They're lined up to come in the right way. God bless them for doing that. But that line of legal waitees, to maybe coin a phrase, the line of people who were willing to respect American immigration law, get in line and wait in line, isn't just some short little low line that you can put 11 to 20 million people behind and think you're going to process them through. That line of people who are respecting American laws and are waiting to come into the United States legally, none of them are in the United States. It's 50 million strong, Mr. Speaker. 50 million people have taken the trouble to line up to try to come into the United States legally. We are the most generous country in the world by far, letting in around 1.25 million legal immigrants. Very small percentage of them actually come here because of merit, as I said. And meanwhile, we've got 11 to 20 million here in this country that have disrespected our laws. And I would suggest that I would a lot rather see 11 to 20 million who are in the line, respecting American laws, waiting to come in. I would like to see them come in and become American citizens ahead of those who've disrespected American laws. That sustains the rule of law. That upholds the rule of law. That strengthens us as a nation. And rewarding lawbreakers weakens the rule of law and weakens us as a nation and chisels away at that beautiful marble pillar of American exceptionalism called the rule of law. That's the equation. And I hear constantly arguments from people that have their own interest, their own viewpoint. They need somebody to milk the cows, or they need somebody to take care of their equestrian herd, or they need somebody to do their gardening. They need somebody to be their butler or their maid. So they're saying, you know, I can't afford to hire somebody in this country. You need to bring me some cheaper labor. I'd suggest that Robert Rector of the Heritage Foundation is right. We have become a welfare state. And a household headed by a high school dropout, without regard to their immigration status, costs the taxpayer annually $23,499 a year. Actually, I think it was $23,449 a year, if I could correct that. But it boils down to this, that they'll draw down $32,000 a year in benefits, welfare state. They'll pay $9,000 a year in taxes, and that's the change. That's the difference. And when you multiply it times 50 years of managing the household, being a head of a household, 50 years, it costs the taxpayers an average of $1.5 million to subsidize that household. And that's a high school dropout. Now, it may not get worse when they're an illegal high school dropout, but it doesn't get a lot better. There's a net number, too, that he produces. I think that's around the order of $19,499 a year. In this area, let's say $20,000 a year, plus or minus 1,000 or two, for a household headed by a high school dropout and or / an illegal immigrant. Now, the burden to the taxpayer, because we're a welfare state, can't be ignored. And the weight on the taxpayers, when we have an oversupply of cheap labor and an undersupply of taxpayers, and 47% of households don't pay income tax. We're living in a welfare state, and we're giving automatic citizenship to 340,000 to 750,000 babies a year that are born to an illegal mother who sneaks into the United States. And then the president has the temerity to go down to the border in El Paso and make fun of people who think like I do, that say, let's build a fence, a wall, and a fence. He said some will want a moat, some will want alligators in it. He was standing down there within 220 yards of this, Mr. Speaker. This is El Paso, Texas. This is Juarez, Mexico. Some people would want a moat. Some people would want a fence. Some would want alligators in it. I don't think there are any alligators in here, Mr. Speaker. But this is the aerial picture that I had seen just a few weeks before the President gave this speech in El Paso. The records are good. Not many people are getting across the border here. Why? Because we have, here's a fence right here. This is the Rio Grande River. You have a fence, a river, another fence. Here's a patrol road that's patrolled by the Border Patrol. There's a Border Patrol vehicle right here, another one up around the curve. And then the patrol road, then another fence, then a canal that's flowing a lot of water, and it flows pretty fast. Then another fence. If you can get over that, you're in the United States into El Paso, and maybe you can catch a ride here and you're home free. Not a moat with alligators. You might say 2 moats and 4 fences. A fence, a Rio Grande River, a fence, a patrol road, a fence, a canal with flowing water and deep. Another fence, and then you're off into the United States. 3 of those fences you have to climb wet. This is very effective, and the President is standing within 220 yards of that, making fun of Americans who think that physical structures help control illegal immigration. So we're spending $12 billion a year on the southern border enforcing it and chasing people across the desert 100 miles into the United States. And out of that $12 billion a year, that's $6 million a mile on average for every mile on our southern border. I can build you a fence, a wall, and a fence for about $2 million a mile, about 1/3 of the annual budget. And I don't suggest that we build 2,000 miles of it right away, Mr. Speaker. I suggest that we start building it and stop building when they stop going around the end. That's the scenario. That's the logical way to address this. Build a fence, a wall, and a fence. Use the funding that we have. Roll it into that kind of infrastructure. It is effective. And the President's staff didn't serve him very well if he was standing with his back to a fence, a river, a fence, a patrol road, another fence, a canal, and another fence. That's the barriers to get into the United States. And he's making fun of it, and the Border Patrol is telling us this is effective. It is effective. It's been effective in El Paso. It keeps them in Juarez. It's been effective in San Luis and southwest Arizona. It's not effective where there is nothing. And we have to pay a lot of people a lot of time and money to chase all over the desert after people that walked around the end. Let's build it till they stop going around the end. Let's pass the Birthright Citizenship Act of 2011. Let's make sure that the kind of security that's out at El Paso can be applied in other high-traffic areas. Build the fence till it stops going around the end. And then, Mr. Speaker, we can also pass my new IDEA Act, which shuts off the federal deductibility for wages and benefits paid to illegals, brings the IRS into this mix, and gives the employer safe harbor. All of that, simple solutions to a complex problem, Mr. Speaker. I would conclude with that statement, and thank you for your attention, and I'd yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time.
I yield back.
Does the gentleman have a motion?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
Today in the House, members continued work on the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2012.